Frances Wright, America's Forgotten Radical.
Episode 5, Amalgamation and What Really Made People Hate Frances Wright. I'm Trista Yeager.
And I'm Eleanor Rust.
We're two history freaks with PhDs. This is a podcast about Frances Wright, reformer, philosopher, writer, activist, abolitionist before it was cool, and feminist long before the word existed. Just a quick warning, this episode discusses sexual assault. Please take care while listening.
Today, we're returning to remote Western Tennessee, where things aren't going well at Frances's intentional community of Nashoba. In episode 3, we covered what drew Fanny to utopian communities and the Midwestern frontier. Then, in episode 4, we dug into how Fanny designed Nashoba to model the end of American slavery and a new paradigm for racial integration, 3 decades before the Civil War. But the Nashoba experiment becomes mired in scandal and controversy, all circling around a single problem.
That problem isn't perhaps what you'd expect. When one of the white community members, a guy named James Richardson, sends an update to an abolitionist paper, the wonderfully named Genius of Universal Emancipation, he chronicles his abuse of his fellow residents at Nashoba, including physical abuse in line with typical enslaver practices. But that abuse isn't what gets the world all riled up and opposed to Fanny's plans. It isn't what shuts the doors of respectable and wealthy friends in New York and London in Fanny's face. It's something else. It's interracial personal relationships, known at the time as amalgamation.
In his report, James Richardson reveals that the community lives by the ideals of free association between the sexes. And to underline this, he announces that he has started a sexual relationship with a young woman named Josephine, a free woman of color, and that they aren't really bothering with the formality of marriage. This double transgression was too much for the American and European public at the time. Richardson starts a debate with anonymous critics on the pages of the Genius, and Fanny leaps to his defense in personal letters and public statements, arguing that this kind of relationship is the only way to move beyond racial inequality for a country built on oppressing people of African descent.
Here's how she put it, and hold on, this is a long one and includes some outdated terms to describe people who were racialized according to the systems and thinking of the 19th century. The categories and the ideas about what they meant are very different in Fanny's day.
While occupied, as they finally hope, in paving the way for the moral regeneration of American citizens of colors, the trustees of Nashoba believe that slavery may safely be left to work its own ruin. The principles avowed in this paper may attract the national attention and the olive branch of peace and brotherhood be embraced by the white man and the black, and their children, approached in feeling and education, gradually blend into one their blood and their hue. Those to whom the American institutions and American character are familiar and who have considered the question of Negro slavery in all its bearings will probably be disposed to pronounce with the writer of this address that the emancipation of the colored population cannot be progressive through the laws. It must and can only be progressive through the feelings and through that medium be finally complete and entire, involving at once political equality and the amalgamation of the races. And has nature, as slave apologists would tell us, drawn a Rubicon between the human varieties of physiognomy and complexion, or need we enter into details to prove that no natural antipathy blinds the white Louisianian to the charms of the graceful quadroon, however the force of prejudice or the fear of public censure makes of her his mistress, and of the whiter-skinned but often not more accomplished or more attractive female his wife? Or must we point to the intercourse in its most degraded forms, where the child is the marketable slave of its father? Idle indeed is the assertion that the mixture of races is not in nature. If not in nature, it could not exist. And, being in nature, since it does happen, the only question is whether it shall take place in good taste and good feeling, and be made at once the means of sealing the tranquility and of perfecting the liberty of the country. The education of the race of color would doubtless make the amalgamation more rapid as well as more creditable. And so far from considering the physical amalgamation of the two colors, when accompanied by a moral approximation as an evil, it must surely be viewed as a good equally desirable for both. In this belief, the more special object of the founder of Nashoba is to raise the man of color to the level of the white, where fitted by habits of industry and suitable dispositions to receive him as a brother and equal, and after due trial as a proprietor trustee of the property, to educate his children with white children, and thus approaching their minds, tastes, and occupations to leave the affections of future generations to the dictates of free choice.
This was a bombshell at the time. Yes, Fanny is still paternalistic in some of her arguments, but she's also radically in favor of a level of equality few others were advocating. The form of this equality is striking. Not only is Fanny calling out reprehensible practices of systematic sexual abuse and rape by enslavers, but she's insisting that ties of true, free affinity between equal partners of different races are the appropriate response to this poisoned well, and that these ties will build a better America.
These ties are far, far more common now, something Fanny would have appreciated. And we should also be grateful for this. We're fortunate to have the chance to forge them. We also still got a lot of work to do. But the past can help us grasp where this work lies, what some Americans face, and how these past sorrows and injustices still impact how we regard each other.
It's hard to convey how radical a position Fanny was taking at the time, but we're going to try. By bringing in some extremely smart scholars to discuss their research on interracial relationships, the history of women of color in the U.S., and how slavery distorted everything, even for free African Americans in the North. This history is important to keep in mind, not only to recognize the progress we've made as a society, but also to look for our opportunities for growth. This history is American history, not a sidebar.
At the time Nashoba was a going concern, there were lots of legal limitations and social mores governing the lives of African Americans and their interactions with whites. But there were also a variety of different relationships and ties between white and Black Americans. To explore the context, both legal and social, that surrounded Nashoba, we spoke with Leslie M. Harris, who also helped us frame our discussion in episode 4. Today, she shines a light on what became a huge problem for Frances, amalgamation, which can cover a wide range of activities, not just intimate relationships. She also helps us understand how this concept was weaponized by those who thought the races should live separately.
So under slavery, there are limits on the interactions that African Americans can have with each other and with whites. So, for example, out of fear of slave rebellion, there are laws in New York before the Revolution that say no more than, I don't know if it's 3 or 5 African American people could gather at one time. There are regulations about when they can bury their dead. I don't remember if there's a law specifically against mixing and fraternizing with white people, but there's definitely a fear that mixing with each other, particularly laboring class people mixing with each other, Black and white, will lead to chaos, will lead to disruption, will even lead to slave rebellion. And in fact, the 1741 slave conspiracy, as it's sometimes called, was really a conspiracy, believed to be a conspiracy among Black and white workers who gathered in a white-owned bar and who were having a difficult time on slightly different bases. And their activism, eventually it's believed by those in charge, results in arson attempts to signal the pressure that they felt under as enslaved people or as poor people at the time. And that leads to one of the bloodiest, quote-unquote, justice moments in New York's early history, where many enslaved people are hanged, a few of the white collaborators are hanged, other enslaved people are shipped out of the colony to Jamaica and the other parts of the Caribbean as punishment. So it's a very startling moment, a very chaotic moment, and frankly, a deadly moment for Black people who dared speak out or try to resist or rebel against enslavement. After slavery ends, those kinds of laws are no longer relevant, but the connection you're drawing is a good one, that there is still a kind of stigma or concern when Black people gather in groups and in terms of their interactions with whites. The New York Manumission Society, which contains some of our founding fathers, such as John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, other wealthy middle-class people, they really work to end slavery in New York and get the first gradual emancipation law passed. That takes effect in 1799 on July 4th. So clearly aligning it with the ideals of the nation. And other New Yorkers, they are viewed as elites, white elites who are sharing their elite status with enslaved and soon to be free African Americans. And other New Yorkers see that as problematic. They are concerned about that sharing of elite status. They are concerned that free Blacks will now compete with them for jobs. They do not want them voting, although they have the right to vote on the same basis as whites at this time if they become free. And over time, there develops a lot of tension about what will the position of these free African Americans be in New York. By the time slavery ends in 1827, the new state constitution has created a space for Black people as citizens where they are again less than. Mm-hmm. They have to own property to vote when all Black men have to own property to vote when all white men can vote. You know, this is the time of universal white manhood suffrage, and Black people are excluded from voting. They are thought to be uniquely subject to corruption, and that's part of the rationale for saying that if they own property, they have proved their independence. Of course, white men, there's a fear that Black men will sell their votes more so than white men will, but we know that there's corruption everywhere. This probably sounds familiar to us today.
Yeah, indeed.
You know, putting this fear of corruption on a group that is no more subject to corruption than anyone else. More broadly, in terms of thinking of citizenship, not only as voting rights, but also thinking of it as who owns the city, who can use the city at an equal rate as other groups of people. Black people, when they gather to celebrate the end of slavery or other holidays that celebrate their history, they are often targeted by whites. And because the end of slavery falls on July 4th, July 4th becomes a quote unquote white holiday. And African Americans actually celebrate the end of slavery, not on July 4th when it happens, but on the following day, because they don't want to end up in a fight, in a literal mob, a riot with whites who are celebrating July 4th as the celebration of the nation. So there are all these ways, both symbolic but real, that whites claim that African Americans are not the same in terms of citizenry. And that's the mass of whites. So with the New York Manumission Society, some of those members, once slavery ends in the North, turn their efforts to ending slavery in the South. And they become part of what's known as the radical abolitionists. Radical abolitionists are inspired by the Second Great Awakening and a reconsideration of Christianity. They are evangelical in that they really believe that it is the goal of religious Christians to perfect humanity on earth. And for some of them, part of that perfection of humanity, of the nation, is to end slavery. And they see slavery as a sin. Slavery, in their view, and this is an old view from the Quakers, if you are in control of someone else, that person doesn't have the free will to not sin. You can make them do anything. And they can't live out their moral life. And so the radical abolitionists take up this charge and they say that, you know, slavery is sinful because it forces other people to sin, but they also publicize what the sin is. And one of the big sins is sex. That enslaved women in particular, they don't talk about enslaved men, but I think we still need to do some research on the sexual abuse of enslaved men. But definitely the sexual abuse of enslaved women, of course, forces those women into sinful relationship, but it also, the white enslaver is committing sin. And that's that's probably the most controversial element of their argument, that slavery is a sinful structure, that this is not a good societal structure. There's also the separation of families that occurs. via the auction block that they also emphasize. And and the punishment, the ways in which enslaved people are punished, all of these things they say are sinful, and that if they combine this focus on sin also with a focus on the ideals of the nation, if we really believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that all men are created equal, well, enslavement, these are men. Am I not a man and a brother? Am I not a woman and a sister? These are the symbols of and the statements that they carry out into the world. And you don't enslave the people who you believe are equal to you in the eyes of God. So on a religious basis. So they're really pushing this idea that slavery is sinful. It is America's sin, and it needs to stop immediately. This, of course, is very threatening, not only to Southerners, but to some Northerners as well, because the slave produced goods, particularly cotton, 75% of enslaved people grow cotton. That cotton fuels Northern industry. It fuels industry in England. It fuels a lot of the Industrial Revolution. So to end slavery would be, to some degree, to upend this new economic system that is producing great wealth. The radical abolitionists are middle-class people. Like the earlier abolitionists, they are also sharing their status, their political status with Black people, and that comes to be seen as very threatening.
And your research indicates really clearly how the sort of the discourse around this became very connected to sexuality, even though nothing, that wasn't happening per se. You don't have any evidence of that. And, a lot of African Americans are saying, we don't want to marry, white people. We just want to do our thing and be treated as citizens. So it's a really interesting rhetorical shift that you point to that leads to some pretty intense real world consequences. So let's talk for a second about the term that was used at the time, which is also a term used to vilify Frances Wright, amalgamation. Can you help us unpack this term a little bit, give us the historical context and sort of what it meant to people at the time?
So initially, amalgamation was a pretty neutral term, and it was used in a variety of spaces. It did not necessarily refer to Black-white relationships, specifically or only uniquely. But by the 1820s, 1830s in New York, it becomes quite a negative term, specifically aimed at Black-white interactions. So these interactions can range from socializing, dancing, political activism, all the way to sexuality. And whites who are anti-racial equality really take up this charge that the radical abolitionists, that the main thing they want to do is support and encourage amalgamation, the mixing of races. Of course, we continue to have this charge down to the civil rights movement in the 20th century, but this is one of the places where it started. Of course, it's that, it kind of reverses the true power structure, which is in the South, where white enslavers are sexually abusing Black women. There's much less abuse going on in the North. There are interracial relationships, but they're actually, I would say, fewer happening in the radical abolitionist circles. Where they're happening is in working class neighborhoods where Black and white people live together, work together, end up sometimes sharing housing and marrying and having children. But that's not the focus in this early time period. The focus and there are caricatures and cartoons are really of radical abolitionists, particularly white women, who are middle-class women, and they're depicted as very sensitive and feminine, who are marrying Black men. And the Black men are depicted as dark and kind of their features are crudely drawn. And so it's presented as this real, you almost want to say it's like an offense against nature. And there's a famous set of images that shows first a scene where clearly Black men and white women are together in a political setting, and then in a dance setting, and then you see them married, one Black man and one white woman, and then into the room enters William Lloyd Garrison, supposedly to see the fruits of his hard labor, this wonderful Black and white family with mixed-race children, and I think it's a Black dog and a white cat, or a white cat and a Black dog. I mean,
Wow.
the care with which the detail of this drawing. And it's really to make fun of the idea that Blacks and whites can be equal, but even not just equal, that they can be equal as middle-class people, because this is a middle-class household. So again, it's a fear not simply of racial mixture, but also of elevating Blacks to equality with an elite and newly powerful middle-class group, these religious, evangelical, radical abolitionists. This discussion, debate, caricatures, all of these things lead eventually to what are called the Amalgamation riots in New York City, where newspapers whip up fears of amalgamation, and there's 3 or 4 days of rioting in alignment with the American Anti-Slavery Society meetings that are happening to end slavery in New York in 1834. And one of the things that the writers charge and that the newspapers hammer on is this idea that the radical abolitionists support interracial marriage, which is true. Lydia Maria Child, New York never has a law against interracial marriage. But in Boston, in Massachusetts, there is a law against interracial marriage. And Lydia Maria Child, a famous abolitionist at the time, and other abolitionists in Massachusetts do fight to get that law removed. They see it as encouraging sin. If Black people and white people fall in love and they can't legally marry, then they have to, quote unquote, live in sin. So why would you force that rather than just allow people to marry and have a legitimate household? And so there is some truth that the radical abolitionists are seeking racial equality, but it's not the only thing, and it's what should be available to citizens of the time. And again, ironically, New York does not have a law against interracial marriage or interracial socializing at this time, and yet these riots are a way to try to enforce a societal norm in which Blacks and whites don't mix.
Yet the truth is, interracial relationships happened in America. The rules of when they were socially acceptable in places like the American South highlight how intimate activities could not be allowed to violate the cruel hierarchies of racialized power or to cross from domestic secret into public life. Yet some broke these rules, well, sort of. And as we'll hear from our next scholar, Amrita Chakrabarty-Myers.
Amrita is a professor of history and gender studies at Indiana University, and her latest book paints an impressively detailed portrait of Julia Chin, who was enslaved by and also wife to an early U.S. vice president. We'll get more into Julia's story in a second, but first, Amrita lays out the context for many instances of interracial relationships in the South in the early 19th century.
One of the things that for a long time, there was no acknowledgement that these relationships were even happening, right? That, oh no, interracial sex didn't happen. It never happened. And then it was like, well, if it did happen, it was only between like the poorest of people in the lowest of classes, not amongst people of like value or worth or education or, position, right? And if that happened, they hid it behind closed doors. They were ashamed of it. They certainly never came out in public with it. Interracial sex was happening all the time. Right? And the thing is that white Americans could deal with that back in the day as long as it was under certain kinds of contexts. Like, as long as you're not acknowledging the person, as long as you're in a position of power and authority over them, as long as they're not your equal, you're not trying to bring them into good, polite society, you're not acknowledging your children. Like, it was to most, I would say at this point, most white men in the slave South were having, at some point had, or, whether it was short-term or long-term or one night or whatever, had sex with a Black woman, right? We have very sadly detailed plantation records and oral testimonies that talk about white boys coming of age when their fathers took them down to the quarters and chose a woman or a girl for them to have sex with to lose their virginity. So it's not that the interracial sex isn't happening, but as long as it's happening where the white person is the white man, first of all, it has to be white men with Black women. White women could not be having sex with Black men necessarily, right? That was less, right? Although Martha Hodes has done really good work on that to show that that could even be dealt with and acknowledged and ignored up to a certain point, right? Up to a certain point. And as long as, again, if it was working class women, indentured servants, poor women, there was less threat to the structure of white supremacy. There was less threat to the structure of white male patriarchy. But for white men to have sex with enslaved Black women was fine. That maintained the hierarchy of not only race and slavery, but also gender. Men over women, free over enslaved, white over Black. It maintained all of those hierarchies. The problem became when interracial couples attended to take their families and their relationships across the public-private divide. When it's behind closed doors, at home, and you're not trying to make anybody recognize or approve or substantiate, that relationship is fine. But if you're going out into the community, if you're going to public parties, if you're going to church, if you're going to town barbecues, if you're demanding that the legal records and the courts recognize your relationship, recognize your partnership, recognize your children and their ability to inherit from you, that's when it becomes a problem. Because now you're actually saying that these Black women should be treated like white women. They should have all the rights of white women, that they should be given the ability to come to town balls, that they should be allowed to ride in carriages, that they should be allowed to sit on the floor in church, right? That they should be able to dress a certain way and be accorded a certain amount of respect. Those are all things that were reserved for white women alone. So that's when we get this conflict that happens, because people are like, the sex is happening everywhere. But as long as you lie about it and hide it and don't acknowledge it, you're good.
Yeah.
Right. So why was Jefferson still upheld as like one of the founding fathers of the nation and this amazing, American hero? Because he never acknowledged Sally Hemings. He never acknowledged their children. I mean, it was an open secret, but he still maintained that illusion. Johnson doesn't. Johnson, right, acknowledges Julia. They live together. He educates their daughters. Like I said, she has all this power, especially when he's not there. He tries to take it. He takes his family to church. He tries to take his daughters to local balls. And so that's where we see the problem. So we have to understand that, yeah, sex was happening. The fact that people used to say forever that it wasn't happening is a lie. It's not just happening amongst the lower classes. It's happening across all classes. And the problem is not that the sex is happening. The problem comes in when white men attempt to take their Black families across the color line and say, this is my family, right? My daughters should be able to inherit. They should be able to marry in church. They should be able to, that's when it's like, because again, it comes into direct conflict with, these are privileges that are set aside for white women, white ladies. And it actually literally becomes the language of ladyhood versus, womanhood. Like you could all be women, but only some people could be ladies. Ladyhood is set aside for white women, right? And so that used to be about class within the white community, where there was serving women, indentured servitudes. That the word used to be, back in England, they used to refer to wenches, right? And wenches were lower class serving women who were indentured, who worked in pubs. In the United States, in the Americas, the term wench increasingly becomes a racialized term. And so eventually all white women are able to acquire, right, this understanding of, this cloak of respectability and because of whiteness, right, they can become ladies. Even if they're poor, even if they're indentured, over time, whiteness expands to be able to accommodate that. Wench becomes a term reserved for Black women alone, whether they're free or enslaved. It becomes racialized. And so the problem is, how dare you try to bring wenches across the color line and make them ladies? That's the issue.
The wench-lady divide and the way interracial relationships were understood are more than a historical curiosity. These conflicts and contradictions point to how Americans built up a very specific and charged concept of race, a notion that can't be separated from power structures. As a white American, your race could change if you, say, married a person of color.
Amrita says it best. You'll hear her refer to Johnson, who is Richard Mentor Johnson, the 9th Vice President of the United States, and Julia Chinn's husband and enslaver.
There are white men and white women, certainly, who, because they choose to engage in interracial sex, lose their whiteness, right? And that's how we see how race really is a social construction, because it's not just about passing. It's about the fact that those who are in power can choose to sort of take away, right, someone's whiteness and the respectability and status and privilege and power that comes with it, because they've chosen to cross the color line and engage in these kinds of relationships. That, you know, it's very easy, certainly, for white women to fall, right, in terms of, but even for white men, right, like I said, men like Jefferson and Clay never lose their stature because they keep their private and their public separate. But men like Johnson and Kingsley and others, it becomes an issue. There's a newspaper editor who said it best when he was talking about Johnson. You know, he said, the voters could have forgiven him anything if only he had been discreet. The problem was not the sex. The problem was the public nature of it. But you see that this is how, like, you can see race literally being constructed around these relationships and in the arguments and debates and conversations over these relationships. Like, there are people who were like, when they talked about Johnson's 2 daughters who married white men, they said, well, if you can call a man white, if you can still call a man white who has fallen so far as to willingly, hold the sable paws of, like, literally, this is the kind of language they use, like, to join hands with, or take the paw. They called them paws like they were an animal, right? Like, can you still call these men white when they've willingly, like, sold their soul for, and taken up the paws of a sable, wench in order to acquire property? So, like, this was the language that was being used to sort of say, like, if you behave in certain ways, you actually, even as a powerful, wealthy white man, can lose that whiteness and the privileges that come with it.
Here's a very important point that Amrita makes exceedingly clear in her work. Just because people are intimate, we should not romanticize these relationships. It's impossible to ignore the exploitative power dynamics of these arrangements.
There is profound value, however, in examining these women's lives and how society treated or remembered these lives. In fact, these women deserve our attention. Now we get to hear Amrita tell the story of Julia Chinn, who moved in Johnson's social circles and ran his plantation, yet who never gained her freedom. Amrita's research findings and process touch on so many moments of American history in the Upper South, the same region where Nashoba was located. She walks us through how she elegantly pieced together Julia's life from very disparate sources.
So Julia, as I said, was born in the 1790s. We don't know her exact date of birth because, like with most enslaved people, it was not recorded anywhere that I've been able to discover. She and her mother and her brother were all owned by Robert and Jemima Johnson, Richard's parents. And they grew up at the parents' estate, which was called Johnson Fort or Johnson Station. This is, right, territorial Kentucky, frontier Kentucky. And it was literally a fort surrounded by a stockade. So that's where, Julia and her mother and her brother lived. And it was right next door to what would become Great Crossing Baptist Church, which was the family's church. The senior Johnsons helped to found and establish that church. They gave the church the land to build the structure on. And it was literally next, it was part of their plantation property. It was next door to where they lived. And so Julia grows up at Johnson Station at the fort. And then when she's about 13 or 14, the senior Johnsons transfer her along with about 100 other laborers to one of their children, which is Richard, right? The Johnsons had many kids, but as the kids came of age, struck out on their own, got married. Their parents transferred land to them, cash, gifts of enslaved laborers. And so Richard acquires a 2,000-acre plantation and 100 enslaved laborers from his parents, and he builds his home just a couple of miles away from where his parents live and where the church is. So Julia and her brother Daniel are part of the 100 enslaved laborers who are transferred to him at this point, but not Henrietta. So their mother is left behind at Johnson Station. And within a year of arriving at Blue Spring Farm, Richard's farm, she's tapped to become the housekeeper of the property. And that's a significant role for a large plantation, especially for a plantation where there's no wife. Richard didn't have a wife. He wasn't married to anyone. So there's no mistress on the plantation to oversee things, particularly when Richard is away for 6 months every year living in DC. And so within a few weeks, Julia is appointed housekeeper, which means she's going to oversee the domestic enslaved labor force. She's going to, be in charge of the accounts, shopping, food, taking care of guests, helping to host large parties, and also making sure that the field hands are doing their work, meting out punishments, all of that kind of stuff. It's a big job. It's a big job for anybody, legal wife or not, so especially for a 2,000-acre plantation, for a bachelor politician who liked to throw huge parties like Richard did. Like on a moment's notice, Julia would have to put together a party for 200 people. This was her life. And so and keep in mind that she's 14 years old, right? 13, 14 years old.
Holy cow.
So within a few weeks, she's, been given charge of the estate, carrying the keys, dealing with white laborers, enslaved, laborers, the money, the shopping, the parties, all of that. Within a year, her and Richard have begun a sexual relationship, which will last a quarter century and which will produce 2 daughters. And I know that because I have the date of birth for their oldest daughter, and I'm able to therefore backtrack and kind of, begin to lock into place exactly when, the sex between the two would have begun. And they would go on to have another daughter, and newspaper records from the area make it very clear that the two of them were a couple, that she was in charge of Blue Spring when Richard was away. She was the mistress of Blue Spring Farm, that she dealt with local vendors, contractors, the students at the future Choctaw Academy, the headmaster and teachers of the school. I mean, there was nothing on that 2,000-acre plantation that she was not, directly involved with. So this is who Julia is. This is how I kind of found her. This is the outlines of her life, which are very significant. She has medical training. She helps to take care of the students at Choctaw Academy who get sick. When there's a cholera epidemic that breaks out in 1833, she's the one who's taking care of the enslaved laborers, the students, and other family members who fall ill. So she does it all, from cooking to cleaning to supervising to sewing. There's a huge seamstressing staff. Black women who sew for the students of Choctaw Academy. They make all of their clothing. She oversees them. She oversees the enslaved women who do the washing and the laundry, the folks in the dining hall who prepare all the meals for the students. So she is raising her children, running a business, a farm that's growing hemp and cotton and corn. And she's also in charge of the school in terms of making sure that it's a boarding school. So she's in charge of making sure that food and clothing and medicine and shelter are all provided for the students. She's not directly involved in teaching the kids, but she's pretty much involved in every other aspect of it. So this is the outlines of her life come together in terms of how I built my archive and my source space. So that kind of goes to the second question that you had asked me, how do I put the outlines of this woman's life together? Because even though she and her daughters were all literate, they all knew how to read and write, we don't have their letters. It appears that those letters were destroyed at some point after Richard passed away. And so we have his letters to other people, but we don't have her letters or her daughter's letters to him, which he references. So there are letters to Thomas Henderson, who was the headmaster of Choctaw Academy, which I used in order to, glean more information about Julia, her responsibilities, her powers, her life, her privileges, and also about her daughters and their education and what they did on the farm and things of that nature. So those letters were really useful. I also did a lot of work. So I looked at letters to other politicians. So Henry Clay, Thomas Jefferson, Martin Van Buren, all contemporaries of Richard's. And Richard served as VP under Martin Van Buren. So I looked in those records. But that wasn't nearly enough in order to really recreate her life. And so I did a deep dive into the records of Choctaw Academy to be able to learn more about the school, how it ran, what Julia's responsibilities were, because the Indigenous students, there's information in the government records on the school and also the letters that the students wrote home to their parents who were in Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma. And so that, those materials were really critical. There was also a lot of material in the Great Crossing Baptist Church records. And so the parish registers are in existence. They go back to the 1790s, almost to the founding date of the church. And so looking at baptismal records, death records, every day, from 1790 to 1870, reading all of the weekly and monthly board meetings, right? Church parish board, reading disciplinary meeting notes, like all of those kinds of materials gave me a window into how the church ran, how Julia and other Black people were treated at the church, how discipline was handled, where Julia and her children would have sat in this church. It gave me the layout of the church, right? There was some church histories that had been written that I went to kind of get a clear idea of the building, how it was structured and set up and laid out. And then what became really crucial as well it's almost like chapter by chapter, I'm looking at different kinds of, using different kinds of sources, right? The first 2 chapters are really dedicated to using Thomas Henderson's letters as a primary sort of central source base, supplemented by other things. Chapter 3 really depends on Henderson's letters, but also Choctaw Academy materials. Chapter 4 looks at the Great Crossing Baptist Church records very closely. Chapters 5 and 6 use newspapers. They local newspapers, state newspapers, and national newspapers to reconstruct what Julia and her daughter's lives were like in Kentucky, the parties that they hosted, the visitors they entertained, but also how people in the local area felt about them, how they reacted to them, the scandals that arose when they tried to ride in carriages or go to local balls, all of those kinds of things. What happened when the daughters married white men and how people were just up in arms. All of those kinds of ideas, thoughts, reactions, behaviors were laid out in the newspapers. People talked about this family all the time because it was a famous political family. Had they just been like regular folks, we might not have that kind of newspaper material information. So that was really important for chapters 5 and 6. And then chapter 7, I was really fortunate that I developed good relationships with about a half dozen descendants of the family. And I interviewed those descendants. The material from those interviews is in the intro and the conclusion of the book, because I believe that it's important for them to be able to tell their stories and to start and finish the book, because the book is as much about history and memory and what we have chosen to forget or erase, what we have chosen to remember and how we remember, not just nationally, but also, on the personal level in a family. Because the small, the personal is connected to the large, the political, very concretely. And so to talk about erasures of national narratives and then to be able to talk really concretely about familial narratives and who gets remembered and what gets forgotten is really critical. So I interviewed these folks. In addition to interviewing them, they very graciously permitted me access to the materials that they had in their possession that had been passed down in their families. So there were not any direct letters from Julia or her daughters, but there were other kinds of really important materials, including photographs from later generations, including material culture pieces like quilts.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, the design cover of my book, which is called The Vice President's Black Wife. I don't know if I've actually mentioned that at this point, but
we'll make sure it's in the show notes.
The cover of the book actually is based on a photograph that I took of one of the family quilts,
cool.
which belonged to Julia's grandson. And so the press took that quilt and they designed an absolutely beautiful book cover based on the pattern of the quilt, which is just phenomenal. I love it. Every time I look at it, I'm so happy with it. So yeah, I looked at material culture pieces that the family had. I looked at their photographs. I interviewed them. I looked at the documents they had from, in terms of census materials, all of that kind of stuff. And so it was really creating the archive for this book was really kind of, I depended a lot. I certainly used written materials and I used materials that were in traditional archives. But I also understood very quickly that if I limited myself to the traditional brick and mortar archive or the settler colonial archive, as I call it, I wasn't going to get enough because those archives were never meant to house Black women's stories.
Mm-hmm.
They were never meant to house enslaved people's stories. And so those were founded by powerful white men to house the stories of other powerful white men. And so that's why it became really important to not just use what was available in those places in terms of written documents, right? Tax records, mortgage, wills, census, but also talk to family members, interview them, use their materials, which one of my students has developed a really distinct methodology. She calls it descendant archival practices, that we need to be willing to talk to descendants, but also look at their personal familial archives and use those things from dishes to quilts to furniture to oral histories to add to the traditional archival collections. I also realized that I needed to go beyond just, traditional historical methodology in terms of source collection. So I walked the land. I took photographs of existing buildings that were still up. I thought about things like clothing, food, crops, weather. I thought about the interiors of buildings, how they were constructed, how they were laid out. And so I actually brought together a lot of different kinds of literatures and methods for not just thinking about Julia, but also the world around Julia in which to place her, how to better contextualize her, because if I didn't have her direct words, could I still understand the kind of house she would have lived in, the kind of bed she would have slept in, the kind of labor she would have performed, the kind of clothing she would have worn, the food she would have eaten, how her mother would have raised her when she was a child. And then also be able to bring in what we do know about other enslaved Black women at the same time period in order to be able to, make informed speculative guesses, right? Informed speculation about her life and how she would have felt and the decisions she would have made, given what we know about women like Anna Kingsley in Florida or Sally Hemings in Virginia, women like Celia, who was enslaved in Missouri. So that these are women who have had more written about them, and we can begin to make informed judgments about how Julia would have lived and responded, given what we know about other women in similar situations.
As Amrita describes, it's not always easy to trace how Black Americans, and Black women in particular, navigated the difficult terrain laid out before them. But scholars like Leslie and Amrita, along with many others, have doggedly run down every possible detail that can connect the dots and fill in the massive blanks in a person's life.
If you want to learn more about working class women as opposed to more privileged women who shape their lives despite the complex dynamics of relationships and systems, I'd recommend checking out the work of University of Alabama scholar Sharoni Green. She's really, really amazing, and I hope, Sharoni, I got your name right. Her book, Remember Me to Miss Louisa, focuses on the details of emancipated Black women in Cincinnati, where many freed women in relationships with white men ended up. You can check out the show notes if you want to get your copy.
Dr. Green's research suggests how women used whatever power they could find to protect their families and forge their own lives. But this isn't unique. We can see it everywhere in early 19th century writings of Black Americans. We can find them crafting narratives of their own lives. And now Leslie Harris will guide us through a wonderful wealth of resources that anyone can explore.
Well, the best place to get a sense of many of these people is what are called the fugitive slave narratives. So these are life stories written by people who escaped slavery in the South and ended up in the North. And they often have a pretty balanced discussion or depiction of certainly life in the South, because the purpose was to demonstrate that slavery is wrong. And these are the reasons why it got so bad that I had to risk my life, literally, or separate myself from my family, as Harriet Jacobs did. She left behind her grandmother. She left behind 2 children because the pressures of enslavement were so difficult. But they also tell about what happens when they arrive in the North. Probably the most famous fugitive narrative that people know is the narrative of Frederick Douglass. His first one, he wrote 3, however. The second one was called My Bondage and My Freedom, and it's expanded beyond enslavement in the South. It's also about his life in the North. And James McCune Smith writes the introduction to that, actually. And part of what he's trying to demonstrate is that there are difficulties in the South, but the North has some work to do too around racism and its attitudes towards slavery and whether or not it's truly anti-slavery. And then he writes a third narrative after the Civil War called The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, which takes you all the... So there are, I think I'm safe in saying, hundreds of these narratives. They're freely available often if you Google. There's a website called Documenting the American South by UNC Chapel Hill, docsouth.org, and you can read these online or print them out at your leisure. And they are amazing narratives, accounts of life in the antebellum period written by formerly enslaved people. And I think that's the most immediate way to get a broader sense of how people experienced life, both in slavery and freedom, but also how they understood America, how they understood the ideals, the nation, how they felt excluded from that, and how they tried to make the case that they should be included. Certainly, Frederick Douglass is often considered the most articulate. His speeches and writings on the meaning of the United States, what to the slave is the 4th of July, probably his most famous speech on this. But many of these individuals, including lesser-known individuals, are also have amazing things to say. One of the narratives I used was called The Fugitive Blacksmith, and it's about a man who was a highly skilled slave, and he loved being a blacksmith, but slavery beat, sometimes literally beat that appreciation for his own skill out of him, and he felt that he couldn't live fully as a highly skilled person unless he left slavery. And he comes to New York and becomes a minister, as well as continuing his work as a blacksmith. So you really get this granular sense of what people are struggling with, how they understand their lives, how they understand what is still a new nation at this point. And we really have to understand that it's not simply that the founding fathers handed down the tablets from Mount whatever. This is not
Mount Rushmore.
No, right, exactly. But that they are, that these ideals are very much being worked out, and Black people are intimately concerned about, symbolized about, unfortunately, sometimes, in how the nation is thinking about who are we? Black people have something to say about that. Of course, white people do, but all of that must get worked out. And of course, part of that working out becomes a civil war with all the violence. But it's because there's just an impossibility of bringing these ideas all together.
Let's get back to Nashoba. Leslie, Amrita, and Sharani Green's work reminds us that the women James Richardson names in his provocative report about Nashoba had feelings and thoughts that we can't recover with the materials that survive. Josephine, the young woman involved, had a perspective that historians should care about, but that perspective wasn't recorded. This means the Nashoba story is incomplete, like far too many stories in American history that ought to center the inner lives and ideas of Black Americans.
All right. So why did James Richardson submit this provocative report, right? I mean, he threw himself publicly on a third rail.
Eleanor, I don't really think he saw it that way. I think he was like, I'm simply telling the truth, just asking questions. It's kind of like the reverse of just asking questions, right? Oh, I'm
just telling it like it is.
Just telling it like it is. So, but this actually has a historical cultural context, right? He's an Enlightenment guy. He's trained in Scotland at a university. He sees this as an experiment. He's running, an experiment and trying to see all the results. So he's going to report the good findings and the bad findings. And, this is just the way this is what he thought they were doing. As strange as that may sound.
Yeah, I guess it pings a little something for me about like how William Godwin wrote a biography of his wife, Mary Wollstonecraft, after she had died, exposing her history of extramarital relationships and her child born out of wedlock, which destroyed her public reputation. This was somebody who loved her, right? But yeah, I think you're right. This sort of like, I'm just saying what happened.
Yeah, so in some ways, the truth with a capital T is more important than any emotional and personal collateral damage that might happen. And I think that's a big part of some directions in Enlightenment thinking. And if you look at his responses in The Genius,
and we're talking about Richardson again.
Richardson,
now.
yes. This is not Godwin. Godwin did not write into The Genius, to my knowledge. So James Richardson's responses are mostly about the extramarital sex part. Like, he doesn't really engage in the race question at all. He doesn't really talk directly to any sort of hints at amalgamation or any other accusations along those lines, though those things were thrown at Frances Wright from other corners. So in some ways, you see that his behavior feels kind of, if you think about it the right way, it's all of one piece, right? He's operating from a position of perceived and downright exploitative racial superiority. He doesn't seem to see that the enslaved Nashobans are his equals, even if he might say that sort of abstractly. When it comes down to brass tacks, he's sort of using his white privilege in a way. And that's why he doesn't see any problem with reporting this, as strange as that may seem to us. I don't know. He's also a weirdo. So that could be the explanation. Yeah. We don't really have enough info about, like, we don't have his diaries, or we have a few letters that he wrote back and forth to Frances, and Frances defended him. That's the weirdest thing. Anyway, fascinating.
So after this controversy erupted, what happened to Nashoba and the Nashobans?
Well, Fanny had to step away from Nashoba. We could also say that she abandoned it in a way, like, depending on how you want to look at what she did. She left Nashoba for health reasons, and she had been suffering from malaria and maybe also from dengue off and on for several years. She had to go to Europe. She went up to New Harmony a couple times just to get away from what at the time was seen as a disease of location. There wasn't any association with mosquitoes or anything like that. So anyway, she turned over control of Nashoba to hired employees. And during a few years of this interim period, it appears that Nashoba was run much like other plantations with a professional overseer. And sadly, I've uncovered in some local Memphis newspapers some oral histories of the women in Nashoba and the abuse that they faced from their neighbors, which is really heartbreaking and terrifying. Eventually, however, Fanny frees the Nashobans and takes them to Haiti, where they can start new independent lives.
So Fanny did fulfill the obligations she'd made to the enslaved people of Nashoba. That's good, I guess.
She didn't, she kept her promise, and she paid with it out of her own funds because Nashoba was not an economic success. But still, the whole enterprise, was trapped in this bigger question. Yeah.
So what impact did this controversy and the failure of Nashoba have on Fanny's later career?
Well, as you can imagine, this kind of scandal gains her a pretty nasty reputation among many middle-class Americans, especially those who are maybe more traditional in their thoughts, or who are not as open-minded about the potential for, interracial harmony. But despite this kind of nasty blowback, she has a lot in the future. I mean, her heyday is honestly yet to come, and we're going to talk about that in the next couple episodes from now. In general, I'd say the scandal just added to her future mystique. Those who supported her saw this as a note to her credit. I mean, we heard from Frances Trollope last episode, who's saying, like, basically, she may have been very misguided, but she did what she's promised to do, and that's a good thing. With all this, and this is where the ambivalence about Nashoba really comes in, we can't forget the people who may have suffered from the scandal more than Fanny did. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information about what happened to many of the people. And people like Josephine, we know actually James Richardson married her and she had children, and she continued to live, to the best of my knowledge, for some time in the Memphis area. But I mean, I've looked on like genealogy websites. I've done as much digging as I possibly can using the internet and my feeble little fingers. But and I'm sure there's really talented genealogists out there who could, run circles around me, but I haven't been able to find all that much about what happened to her afterwards or about her children. So though we do see some stuff from James Richardson pop up in some Memphis papers, like little notices that he's opening a little school or something like that. So
another way in which slavery really stole at least half of our history.
Totally. Like, because, who's to say that Josephine is part of the story and we don't have her story.
So next episode, we'll go deeper into another aspect of Fanny's bad reputation and her important legacy for generations of future Americans.
Readings in this episode were by Emily McGee. Frances Wright, America's Forgotten Radical is a co-production of New Year Media and Her Reputation for Accomplishment, written and hosted by Eleanor Rust and Tristra Yeager.
Made possible by a grant from the Working Men's Institute, New Harmony, Indiana, and by the generosity of the Ephraimson Family Fund. Thanks also to the Bloomington Area Arts Council for supporting this podcast.
Music by Eleanor Dubinsky. Editing and audio support by Josh Perez. See you next time.